Winter had settled over Susa when a man named Nehemiah stood in a marble hall, holding a cup of wine he had not yet tasted. Tasting came first. That was the job. Before the king of Persia drank anything, someone had to drink from the same cup and wait. Because a man trusted with what went into the king's mouth was trusted with something far heavier than a title. Jerusalem had fallen to Babylon more than 100 years earlier. Babylon had since fallen to Persia. Some of the exiles had already been allowed to return home, and the temple had even been rebuilt on its old foundation. But the city itself was still a wound nobody had finished closing. And Nehemiah, born and raised far from it, had built a comfortable life in the very empire that once tore it apart. Then one afternoon, a group of men walked into the palace covered in the dust of a journey that had taken them hundreds of miles. One of them was his own brother. Nehemiah did what anyone would do. He asked about home. He was not ready for the answer. What do you do when the life you have built is safe and respected, but the place your heart never actually left behind is still lying in ruins? That is where this story starts. Not with a battle, not with a sermon, with a man standing in a palace, about to hear a handful of sentences that would end the comfortable version of his life for good. They did not meet him in the throne room. Nehemiah found his brother Hanani and a few other men off to the side, in one of the smaller passages of the palace, still wearing the dust of the road. He asked them the way anyone asks a question they think they already know the answer to. How is it going back home? How are the ones who survived? The ones still living in the province where Jerusalem used to stand. He was expecting an ordinary answer. Slow progress. Maybe. What he got instead was a sentence built to knock the air out of a man's chest. The remnant, they told him, the ones left over from the captivity, are living in the province in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been burned with fire. This was not breaking news. Not really. Jerusalem's walls had been lying in pieces for close to a century and a half by that point. Everyone in Nehemiah's family had grown up knowing this. There had even been an earlier attempt to rebuild them. Years before, an effort that got shut down before it could finish. So this report was not telling him something new. It was telling him something old, in a way he had never actually let himself hear before. That difference matters more than it looks like it does. A lot of people can recite the facts of their own brokenness without ever feeling the weight of them. You can know a marriage went cold years ago and still describe it like a footnote. You can know a friendship ended badly, or a dream quietly died somewhere along the way, and still talk about it the way you talk about weather in a city you don't live in anymore. Old pain has a way of going numb if you carry it long enough. It stops registering as an emergency. It just becomes background noise. Whatever it was in Hanani's voice that day, it did not let Nehemiah keep this in the background. He sat down, not stood there and nodded politely. Sat down, right where he was standing, and wept, and mourned for days, and refused food, and prayed before the God of heaven. Days, not one dramatic breakdown, followed by a quick recovery. A stretch of time long enough that people around him would have noticed something had genuinely shifted. This was a man whose entire position depended on appearing composed at all times, and for a period of days he simply could not perform that role anymore. Something underneath had cracked open. It would be easy to read this and assume Nehemiah was just an emotional man, prone to that kind of reaction. But nothing else about him supports that. Everything later in this story shows a sharp, deliberate mind, someone who thinks in terms of logistics and timing, which is exactly why this moment carries so much weight. A man like that does not sit down and weep for days over something small. There is a temptation now to treat grief like a problem to be handled quickly and quietly, something to process on your own time so it doesn't inconvenience anyone. Say the sad thing once, then get back to normal. Nehemiah does the opposite. He does not rush past what he heard. He does not immediately start drafting a plan for Jerusalem. He sits inside the wreckage of the news for days before he does anything else at all. You cannot skip the sorrow and land safely on the solution. The two are not stages you get to rearrange in whatever order feels efficient. Grief that gets rushed does not usually disappear. It goes underground and comes out sideways later. In places, it was never supposed to show up. What Nehemiah does with those days is not collapse. And it is not despair either. It is something closer to standing still, long enough to let the full size of a loss actually register, instead of managing it, minimizing it, or quietly explaining it away. Before this story shows a single stone being lifted, it shows a man refusing to look away from what was actually broken. 4 months. That is roughly how long the gap was between this moment and the next major turn in the story. The report came in the month of Kislev. What happens next does not happen until the month of Nisan. Anyone moving quickly through this story tends to miss that gap entirely, because the text slides from Nehemiah's mourning into his prayer without announcing how much time actually passed in between. But it is there, sitting quietly in the details, and it changes how the whole opening should be read. Nehemiah did not weep for an afternoon and snap into action. He carried this grief for the better part of a season. And it is worth asking what he was actually doing with all that time. Look closely at what he prayed during those months. He starts by naming who he's talking to. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love, not a vague cry into the dark, a specific address to a specific God, one who had made specific promises long ago and had never broken them. Then something happens in this prayer that gets skipped past too quickly most of the time. Nehemiah does not only mention the sins of the nation in some distant, general sense. He says this: I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you, including myself. Nehemiah had not personally torn down the walls of Jerusalem. He was not even alive when the city fell. He was born into exile, grew up in exile, built a career inside the very empire that conquered his people. And yet here he is, folding himself into the confession, refusing to stand off to the side and point at the wreckage like a spectator. It would have been easy for him to treat this as someone else's failure, a mess inherited but never actually caused by him. Instead, he speaks like a man who belongs to the story completely, someone who understands that you cannot fully grieve something you have quietly positioned yourself outside of. After the confession, the prayer shifts again. Nehemiah reminds God, and really reminds himself, of a promise made generations earlier through Moses. If you are unfaithful, God had said, I will scatter you, but if you return to me and obey me, Even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them back. This is a man reaching backward into memory, pulling forward a promise that had been sitting untouched for generations, and choosing to stand on it. Grief on its own tends to spiral. It needs somewhere solid to land, or it just keeps circling the same wound. Nehemiah gives his grief somewhere to land. He gives it a memory older and steadier than the pain itself. And then, right at the end of this long, unhurried prayer, the tone shifts one more time. Give your servant success today. He writes, by granting him favor in the presence of this man. This man, he never names him directly in the prayer, but anyone reading already knows who he means. The king, his employer, the most powerful human being he would ever stand in front of. Here is what makes this line so striking. At the point Nehemiah writes it, nothing has happened yet. He has not asked the king for anything. He has not even decided how he's going to bring it up. And yet, he's already praying specifically for a conversation that has not taken place. Already asking God to go ahead of him into a room he has not walked into yet. That is not the prayer of a man still stuck in mourning with no direction. That is the prayer of a man whose grief had slowly, quietly, over months, turned into resolve. It would be simple to imagine Nehemiah's prayer and his eventual action as two separate chapters, one ending cleanly before the other begins. But that is not how it actually reads. The planning is already living inside the prayer. The specific request for favor before a specific man is sitting there, months before he ever says a word to the king out loud. Somewhere in those 4 months, without any dramatic turning point recorded for us, the same man who once sat down and wept was becoming the same man who would soon stand in front of an emperor and ask permission to rebuild a ruined city. Nobody watching him in the palace during those months would have known any of this was happening. From the outside, he probably still looked like a cupbearer doing his ordinary job, pouring wine, tasting it first, standing quietly near the throne the way he always had. Underneath, something had shifted completely. The grief had not disappeared. It had simply stopped being formless. It had found a shape, a direction, and a request specific enough to eventually carry into a throne room. This is what grief looks like when it is allowed to finish its work. Instead of being rushed past, it does not turn into numbness. It does not turn into denial dressed up as moving on. Given enough honest time, it turns into a kind of clarity that despair alone could never produce. Rebuilding does not begin with a plan. It begins the moment sorrow stops spinning in place and quietly becomes prayer instead. And prayer, given enough time and enough honesty, has a way of writing the outline of the plan long before anyone ever announces it out loud. That is the first truth this story hands us. And it is easy to miss if you are only watching for the moment the wall goes up. Truth 1. Before anyone rebuilds anything, they have to let their grief become honest enough to turn into prayer instead of despair. Nisan arrived, and with it, an ordinary day that was about to stop being ordinary. Nehemiah picked up the wine the way he had 1,000 times before. He tasted it. He stepped forward to serve the king. Nothing about the routine should have felt any different from any other morning he had stood in that exact spot. Except this time, his face gave him away. It is worth understanding how serious this actually was. because to modern ears it can sound like a small detail. It was not small. In the royal courts of the ancient Near East, a servant standing that close to the king was expected to project calm at all times. Sadness in the king's presence could be read as an insult, even as a threat, a sign that something was deeply wrong, that the servant either could not or would not explain. Men had lost far more than their jobs for far less. The king noticed immediately, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." Nehemiah tells us exactly what happened inside him in that moment. And it is one of the most honest lines in the whole book. "I was very much afraid." Not confident, not composed, afraid. This was a man who had spent 4 months building resolve in prayer. And when the actual moment arrived, fear still showed up right alongside it. That detail quietly ruins the version of this story, where faith simply erases fear the moment you pray hard enough. It does not work that way here. And it rarely works that way anywhere else either. What happens in the very next breath is worth slowing all the way down for. The king asks Nehemiah what he wants. And before Nehemiah answers out loud, before he says a single word back to the most powerful man in the region, the text tells us this: "So I prayed to the God of heaven." That's the entire sentence. No pause in the conversation. No excusing himself to step out of the room. The king is standing right there, waiting for an answer. And somewhere in the space of a breath, Nehemiah turns his attention toward God and prays before he opens his mouth to speak. This might be the shortest prayer recorded anywhere in Scripture, and it might also be one of the most instructive. Real dependence on God does not always look like a retreat into stillness. Sometimes it looks like a single silent breath taken in the middle of a conversation you cannot pause, in front of a person you cannot afford to upset, with everything on the line and no time to think it through any further. Then Nehemiah speaks. He asks to be sent to Judah, to the city where his ancestors are buried, so he can rebuild it. The king agrees, and Nehemiah, having already thought this through with far more precision than a man simply reacting on instinct, keeps going. He asks for letters granting him safe passage through the territories he will have to cross. He asks for a letter to the keeper of the king's forest, so he can be given timber for the gates, the walls, and the house he will need to live in. None of this sounds like a man improvising in the moment. It sounds like a man who had been quietly working out logistics for months, waiting for the door to open so he could walk through it fully prepared. The prayer in that breath did not replace the planning. It arrived on top of planning that had already been done in private, long before the king ever asked his question. Most people eventually face a version of this exact moment, a conversation you did not choose the timing of, a question you were not ready for, asked by someone whose opinion carries real weight over your life, a door that might open or might slam shut, depending entirely on what you say in the next few seconds. Nehemiah's example here is not really about boldness in the way that word usually gets used. He was not fearless. He tells us plainly that he was afraid. What he shows instead is what a person can do with fear that has not been allowed to freeze them completely. Fear was present. It just was not the only thing present. There was also 4 months of prayer sitting underneath it, and a specific request already prepared, waiting for the exact moment it would finally be needed. The king grants everything. and even sends army officers and cavalry along with him. Provision far beyond what a simple request should have produced. Reflecting on the whole exchange afterward, Nehemiah writes something short and direct. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. He does not credit his own courage. He does not credit his own careful planning. Even though the planning was clearly there, he credits the hand of God resting on the whole exchange. From the fear in his chest to the words that finally came out of his mouth. Jerusalem, when Nehemiah finally reached it, was not what a man might picture when he hears the word city. He arrived with letters from the king, an armed escort, and enough authority to summon the entire population if he wanted to. He had every reason to walk straight to the leaders of the province and announce why he had come. That is not what he did. For 3 days he did nothing at all. He rested from the journey. He said nothing to the officials, nothing to the priests, nothing to the nobles or the men who would eventually be doing the actual work. Nobody in the city knew yet what God had put into his heart to do for Jerusalem. 3 days of silence. From a man carrying royal letters and full authority to rebuild a broken city. Then, at night, he got up. He took a few men with him and told no one what he was planning. He did not mount his own animal in front of the city gates where anyone could see him leaving. He rode out quietly, in the dark, so that whatever he was about to see would be seen without an audience, without expectation, and without anyone shaping his impressions before he had formed his own. What follows reads almost like a slow walk through a wound. He went out through the valley gate first, toward the jackal well, and on toward the dung gate, examining the walls that had been broken down and the gates that had been destroyed by fire. He moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, and there the path simply stopped being passable. There was not enough room for the animal he was riding to get through. The rubble was too high, too scattered, too far gone for even a single animal to pick its way across. He had to get down and continue on foot, along the valley, in the dark, examining the wall in silence before turning back the way he had come, through the valley gate again, still without a word to anyone. Picture what that actually looked like. Not a triumphant arrival, not a speech given from a hilltop with the moon behind him. A man walking alone at night over broken stone, close enough to touch the wreckage with his own hands, close enough to hear his own footsteps change from the sound of hooves to the sound of boots picking through rubble, because there was no other way forward. Nobody in Jerusalem knew this was happening. The officials did not know. The priests did not know. The men who would eventually pick up tools and start rebuilding had no idea that, somewhere in the dark that night, the man who would call them to do it was already out there, quietly counting the cost with his own eyes. The instinct, especially now, is to move fast, to announce a plan quickly, to give people something hopeful to hold on to as soon as possible. Nehemiah had every tool available to do exactly that the moment he arrived. He had the king's authority. He had letters. He had an armed escort standing by. He could have called a meeting on his first morning and announced a bold new vision for the city's future. Instead, he spent his first days in silence, and his first real look at the problem happened alone, in the dark, on foot, where he could see it clearly without anyone watching him see it. There is a real difference between hope that has actually walked through the wreckage and hope that has only heard about it second-hand. The first kind can absorb bad news later without collapsing, because it already knows exactly how bad things are. The second kind tends to fall apart the moment reality turns out to be worse than expected, because it was built on an incomplete picture from the very beginning. Only after that night did he finally speak. He went to the officials and told them what had happened, what the king had said, what letters he carried. "You see the trouble we are in," he said. "Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." He does not describe the ruins to them the way someone describes a place they have only heard about. He describes it the way someone describes a place they have already walked through alone. At night, close enough to feel the broken stone under their own hands. That kind of honesty carries weight differently than a second-hand description ever could. It is one thing to be told a wall is broken. It is another thing entirely to be led by someone who has already stood inside the wreckage himself. Someone who is not asking anyone to go anywhere. He has not already gone first. Vision built on an honest look at the damage tends to hold up under pressure. Vision built on assumptions tends to crack the first time reality turns out to be worse than expected. Nehemiah made sure, before he ever spoke a single public word about rebuilding, that his own hope had already survived a walk through the actual ruins in the dark, with nothing but his own eyes to tell him the truth. That is the second truth this story hands us. Truth 2. You cannot rebuild wisely something you have not first walked through honestly, in the dark, before you ever ask anyone else to believe it can be fixed. The morning after Nehemiah finally spoke, something happened that no speech alone could have guaranteed. "Let us rise up and build," they said. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. 4 words carrying the weight of an entire city's decision. No committee vote, no lengthy negotiation. A group of people who had lived inside their own city's disgrace for so long that most of them had probably stopped expecting it to change. And now, suddenly, ready to pick up tools they had likely not touched for exactly this purpose in years. What makes this moment work is not really the speech, even though it was clearly a good one. It is everything that came before it. Months of prayer, a night spent alone walking through the ruins, a leader standing in front of them who was not asking them to imagine a version of the damage he had only heard about, but describing a version he had already walked through himself. People can usually tell the difference between someone selling them a vision and someone who has already paid a personal cost to earn the right to ask for their trust. But the truly remarkable part of this story is not really about Nehemiah at all. It is what happens next. In a chapter of this book, most retellings skip past entirely, because on the surface it looks like nothing more than a long list of names. It is not nothing. It might be the actual heart of the story, if you slow down enough to read it. The high priest and his fellow priests rebuilt the sheep gate. Further along, men from Jericho worked. Next to them, a man named Zacchur. Beside him, the goldsmiths repaired a section, and next to them, the perfume makers. Further down, a group of men worked opposite their own houses, rebuilding the very stretch of wall closest to where they slept every night. In one place, the daughters of a ruler named Shallum are named as having helped repair a section. Women recorded in Scripture doing physical labor alongside everyone else. Further along, men from the town of Tekoa took their assigned portion. And then comes a small detail, easy to miss entirely. The nobles of Tekoa refused to put their shoulders to the work their supervisors assigned them. But the ordinary people of Tekoa kept working anyway, picking up the section their own leaders would not touch. Stretch that list out across the whole chapter, and a picture forms that is far more interesting than a single hero rebuilding a wall by force of personality. Priests worked next to goldsmiths. Perfume makers worked next to men who had walked in from neighboring towns to help with a city that was not even their own home. Rulers' daughters worked. Ordinary townspeople quietly outworked their own nobility. Almost nobody on this list is ever mentioned anywhere else in Scripture. They show up here, take their section of wall, and disappear back into ordinary life once the work is done. It would be easy to tell this story as one exceptional man saving a broken city through sheer force of will. That version makes a good highlight reel, but it also quietly lets everyone else off the hook. Because most people watching are never going to be the one exceptional man standing at the center of a dramatic rescue. The real story is more demanding than that, and also more hopeful. Jerusalem's wall was not rebuilt by one man's vision alone. It was rebuilt because dozens of unremarkable people, most of whose names appear here exactly once and nowhere else in the entire Bible, agreed to take responsibility for one specific section of a much larger problem. Usually the section closest to their own front door. Most broken things in an ordinary life do not actually need one dramatic hero to fix them completely. What they need looks a lot more like what happened in Jerusalem. A family repaired one honest conversation at a time. A community rebuilt one person showing up consistently at a time. A faith restored one quiet, unremarkable act of obedience at a time, performed by someone who never expected to be written into anyone else's story at all. Nehemiah gave the vision. He walked the ruins first, alone, in the dark, and earned the right to ask others to trust him. But it was the goldsmith, and the perfume maker, and the priest, and the ruler's daughter, and the ordinary people of Tekoa who refused to let their own leaders sit this one out, who actually put the stones back in place. Truth 3, and it might be the one easiest to actually live out of everything in this story. Rebuilding almost never happens, because one extraordinary person carries the whole weight alone. It happens because a great many ordinary people agree, all around the same time, to take responsibility for the section of wall standing directly in front of their own house. Word travels fast when something that was supposed to stay broken starts showing signs of life again. A man named Sanballat heard that the Jews were rebuilding the wall, and the text tells us exactly what happened inside him. He was angry and greatly incensed, and he mocked them. He did not do this quietly. He said it out loud, in front of his own associates and the army of Samaria, specifically so the insult would spread as far as possible. "What are those feeble Jews doing?" he said. "Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Then Tobiah, standing beside him, added his own line, sharp enough to survive thousands of years. "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." A fox, not an army. not a siege engine. The insult was not that the wall would fail to withstand an attack. The insult was that it was so flimsy, a small animal wandering by could knock it over without even trying. Opposition to meaningful work rarely arrives first as a serious military threat. It arrives as humiliation, dressed up as an observation, said loudly enough for everyone doing the actual work to overhear it. Watch the timing. This does not happen after the project fails. It happens right when the work has real momentum. Right when people who had lived in disgrace for generations were finally starting to feel like something might change. Sanballat and Tobiah did not wait until the builders gave up to laugh at them. They showed up the moment progress became visible, because that is exactly the moment mockery does the most damage. There is a kind of shame that works faster than almost any physical obstacle ever could. A physical obstacle slows a person down. Shame makes a person want to quietly walk away from the whole thing without anyone even noticing they gave up. A pile of rubble can be cleared with enough hands and enough time. A group of people convinced their own effort is a joke, that everyone around them is already laughing, will sometimes abandon the work without a single stone ever being thrown at them. That was almost certainly the goal. Sanballat and Tobiah were not standing outside the walls with an army ready to attack. Not yet. What they had, in this moment, was ridicule. And ridicule can sometimes accomplish what a siege cannot, because it goes after the will to keep working rather than the wall itself. Nehemiah's response is worth paying attention to, because it is not what a lot of people would expect. He does not walk out to confront Sanballat directly. He does not try to win the argument in front of a crowd. He turns toward God instead. Hear us, our God. He prays, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. The prayer is raw and unmistakably angry, and Scripture does not sand it down to sound more polished. Nehemiah does not pretend the insult did not hurt. He takes the full weight of it to God, rather than either swallowing it silently or firing back at Sanballat in public. Then comes one of the most understated lines in the entire book. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. For the people worked with all their heart. That is the entire response to weeks of public ridicule. They kept building. No dramatic confrontation. No clever comeback that silenced the critics for good. Just the sound of stone being set on stone, day after day, while the mockery kept happening somewhere in the background and slowly started to matter less than the work itself. It would be easy to twist this into something it is not. It is tempting to hear a story like this and start treating every critic in your own life as a modern Sanballat, someone to be dismissed the moment they raise a concern. That is not the lesson here. Sanballat's mockery was specific, aimed at a specific work God had clearly called Nehemiah to do. In a specific moment. Not every disagreement a person faces deserves to be filed under persecution. What this story does show, clearly, is a simpler pattern worth recognizing. Meaningful work rarely gets mocked after it fails. It gets mocked right when it starts succeeding, right when the people doing it begin to believe, for the first time in a long time, that the thing they are building might actually stand. Mockery had not worked. The wall kept rising day after day, and Sanballat's laughter had failed to stop a single stone from being set into place. So the pressure changed shape when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed. They were very angry. They plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. This was no longer ridicule shouted from a distance. This was a real, coordinated threat, involving multiple gridae after multiple directions, aimed at stopping the work by force before it could finish. The people of Judah heard about it, and fear started speeding through the workforce almost immediately, along with something quieter and more corrosive than fear. The strength of the laborers is giving out, the people said, and there is so much rubble we cannot rebuild the wall. Nehemiah did not scold them for feeling it. He stationed people by families, with their swords, spears, and bows, behind the lowest points of the wall, the most exposed sections, and told them plainly not to be afraid. Remember the Lord, he said, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and daughters, your wives and your homes. From that point on, half the men worked while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, and armor, and even the ones carrying materials worked with one hand while holding a weapon in the other. Nehemiah kept a trumpeter close by his side, ready to sound an alarm the instant trouble appeared anywhere along the wall, so everyone could rally to that exact point immediately. When direct force failed to intimidate them into stopping, Sanballat and his allies tried something quieter. They sent word to Nehemiah 4 separate times, inviting him to come and meet with them at one of the villages on the plain of Ono. Nehemiah understood exactly what was being offered here. They were scheming to harm me. He writes plainly. His response, all 4 times, was the same short sentence. I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? 4 times. The same offer, the same refusal, worded almost identically each time. That was not 4 separate decisions made fresh in the moment. It was one decision, made once, applied consistently every time. The same trap opened again in a slightly different disguise. When invitation failed, the accusation started. Sanballat sent an unsealed letter this time, deliberately left open so anyone carrying it along the road could read the contents and let the rumor spread before it even reached its destination. The letter accused Nehemiah of planning a rebellion, claimed he intended to crown himself king, and warned that this report was already on its way to the Persian throne unless he agreed to come and discuss it in person. Nehemiah's answer was direct. Nothing like what you are saying is happening. He wrote back, you are just making it up out of your own head. One more attempt followed, and it may have been the most dangerous, because it did not come dressed as a threat at all. It came dressed as concern for his safety. A man named Shemaiah, claiming to speak as a prophet, urged Nehemiah to meet him inside the temple and lock the doors behind them, warning that assassins were coming for him that very night. Nehemiah saw straight through it. He was not a priest, and entering that part of the temple was forbidden to him by law. Hiding there out of fear would have violated the very standard he was asking the rest of Jerusalem to live by, and it would have handed his enemies exactly what they wanted. A story about a leader so afraid he broke his own people's law to save himself. Should a man like me run away? He answered, should one in my position go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. Look at what actually happened across this whole sequence. An armed alliance forming to attack the city outright. 4 separate invitations to a quiet, private meeting far from witnesses. A public letter designed to spread a lie before it could be denied. A false warning meant to trap him into an act of cowardice disguised as caution. None of it was a direct assault on the wall itself. Every attempt was aimed at getting Nehemiah to leave his post. Whether through fear, flattery, false urgency, or the appearance of danger. Truth 4. And it is worth carrying into almost any season of resistance a person faces. The enemies of something worth rebuilding rarely attack the work directly. Most often, they simply try to get you to come down from it. There is a detail near the end of this stretch of the story that rarely gets its due, because it sounds almost too small to matter. Nehemiah mentions, almost in passing, that during those weeks none of them took off their clothes. Not that they worked hard during the day and then went home to rest properly at night. Not that they occasionally slept in their gear when things felt tense. None of us removed our clothes. He writes, each of us kept his weapon with him, even when we went for water. Even for water, the most basic errand imaginable, walking to fetch something to drink. And still a man kept a sword within reach. That is not the picture of a project running on adrenaline for a single dramatic afternoon. That is the picture of people living inside sustained, unrelenting tension for weeks on end, never quite allowed to fully exhale. By this point, the threat against Jerusalem was real and coordinated, coming from multiple directions at once. Nehemiah had already organized the people by families, stationed with swords and spears and bows behind the weakest, most exposed sections of the unfinished wall. Half the workforce carried materials, while the other half stood watch in full armor. Even the men hauling stone worked with a tool in one hand and a weapon strapped to the other. And a trumpeter stayed close to Nehemiah at all times, ready to sound the alarm the moment trouble showed up anywhere along the line, so the whole scattered workforce could rush to that single point together. It is tempting to flatten a story like this into something cleaner than it actually was. It is easy to imagine the wall going up in a steady, triumphant montage, stone after stone, morale rising the whole way. That is not what the text shows. It shows exhausted people doing physical labor from sunrise until the stars came out, never fully able to set down their guard, even for a moment, sleeping in their work clothes, because there was no telling when the trumpet might sound. In the middle of all that, the people said something out loud that deserves to be taken seriously rather than glossed over. The strength of the laborers is giving out. They told Nehemiah, and there is so much rubble, we cannot rebuild the wall. This was not weak faith speaking. This was tired bodies speaking. And tired bodies are allowed to be honest about their limits. There is a difference between a person who quits because the work asks too much of their spirit and a person whose muscles have simply run out of what muscles can give on any given day, no matter how willing the heart underneath them still is. Nehemiah does not appear to have treated this complaint as a failure of commitment. He treated it as information, and he responded by reorganizing the defense, not by demanding more from people who had nothing left to give in that moment. It would have been easy for a leader in his position to hear exhausted people and respond with pressure. reminding them how much was at stake, how close they were to finishing, how much history depended on them pushing through. Instead, the story shows a leader who took the complaint seriously enough to change the actual structure of the work, positioning armed families at the weakest points, keeping half the labor force always in reserve, making sure no single section was ever left completely undefended, even while acknowledging that the people carrying stone were running on empty. Most versions of rebuilding, whether it is a wall or a marriage or a career knocked flat by failure, eventually reach a point that looks exactly like this. The initial burst of motivation runs out. The romantic idea of the project fades, replaced by the actual weight of doing the same difficult thing again tomorrow, and the day after that, with no clear end in sight and very little energy left to give it. What gets a project like that across the finish line is rarely a fresh wave of inspiration arriving right on schedule. It is closer to what happened at that wall. Exhausted people still willing to show up with a weapon in one hand and a tool in the other. Not because they felt strong, but because they had already decided, somewhere back before the exhaustion set in, that this particular work was worth finishing even on the days it did not feel worth it at all. There is a strange kind of endurance that has nothing to do with feeling capable. It looks a lot more like sleeping in your clothes, keeping your sword close on the walk to get water, and going back out to lift the next stone anyway. One more time, because stopping now would mean losing ground that had already cost too much to gain. In the middle of everything, while the wall was still going up under armed guard, a different kind of cry rose up, not from outside the city this time, from inside it. A great outcry arose from the people, some of them saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. We must get grain to keep us alive." Others said, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Still others said, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, we have had to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved. But we are powerless, because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. This is not an outside enemy exploiting Jerusalem's people. This is Jewish families, doing hard labor on the same wall for the same shared future, quietly bankrupting other Jewish families in the process. Wealthy nobles were lending money at crushing interest, and when the poorer families could not repay, their land was seized and their own children were taken as collateral, sold into servitude to their own countrymen. Nehemiah's reaction is immediate. "I was very angry," he writes, "when I heard their outcry and these charges." What he does next is not what a leader focused purely on finishing the wall on schedule would necessarily choose to do. He does not tell the people to set this dispute aside until the larger project is complete. He stops. He calls a large public assembly and confronts the nobles and officials directly. In front of everyone, "You are exacting usury from your own people." He tells them, "What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our enemies? Up until now, the danger has always come from outside the walls. Sanballat, Tobiah, the armed alliance threatening attack. This chapter turns the camera around and shows something harder to look at. A wall being built by people who were, at the very same time, quietly tearing each other apart on the inside. The nobles agreed to give back the fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, along with the interest they had charged. Nehemiah made them swear an oath in front of the priests to keep their word. And then, in a gesture that carries its own quiet weight, he shook out the folds of his robe and said, "In this way, may God shake out of his house and possessions everyone who does not keep this promise." There is a detail folded into this chapter that deserves as much attention as the confrontation itself, one that is easy to walk past on the way to the more dramatic moment. Nehemiah reveals that as governor of Judah, he had every legal right to claim food and wine from the people, the same privilege every governor before him had taken without hesitation. The earlier governors, he says plainly, placed a heavy burden on the people and took food and wine from them, besides 40 shekels of silver. Even their assistants lorded it over the people. Nehemiah did not do this out of reverence for God. He says, "I did not act like that." For 12 years, he and his men ate at his own table, fed a large number of officials and visitors from surrounding nations every single day, and never once claimed the food allowance he was legally entitled to demand. That detail changes the entire weight of the confrontation that came before it. Nehemiah was not a man standing at a safe distance, lecturing wealthy nobles about a sacrifice he had never personally made himself. He had already been quietly absorbing that exact same cost for over a decade, refusing the privilege he was owed so the people around him would not have to carry a burden they could not afford. It is one thing to call out injustice from a position where it costs you nothing personally. It is a different thing entirely to call it out after you have already been paying a quiet, unseen cost of your own for years, long before anyone noticed or thanked you for it. A wall can keep an army out. It cannot, by itself, keep a community from quietly destroying itself from the inside while everyone's attention stays fixed on the enemy standing outside the gate. Nehemiah understood that finishing the wall would mean very little if the people living behind it were still allowed to treat each other the way Babylon had once treated all of them. So he stopped the work long enough to fix what was broken between neighbors. And he did it, having already given up more of his own comfort than he was asking anyone else to give up. Truth 5. And it might be the one that cuts closest to home for anyone who has ever tried to rebuild something bigger than themselves. A wall cannot make a people whole if injustice is still living quietly inside the gates it protects. The wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul, 52 days. That is how long it took, start to finish, from the day the work actually began to the day the last stone was set into place, and the gaps that had scarred Jerusalem's skyline for close to a century and a half finally closed. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment, because everything working against this project should have made 52 days sound impossible. An armed coalition had formed against the city, gathering from 4 directions at once. Mockery had rained down from the very beginning, aimed at making the people feel foolish for even trying. Exhausted laborers had openly admitted their strength was giving out. An internal crisis over debt and forced servitude had been serious enough to stop construction entirely while it got resolved. 4 separate attempts, disguised as invitations, letters, and prophetic warnings, had all been aimed squarely at the man leading the project. And still, 52 days, When Sanballat and the rest of Jerusalem's enemies heard the news, something happened that the text records with unusual honesty. All the nations around us were afraid and lost their self-confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. What actually broke their confidence was not the speed alone, impressive as it was. It was the realization that a project facing this much organized resistance, this much internal dysfunction, this much exhaustion, had still managed to reach completion anyway. There was no explanation available to them that fit inside the ordinary categories of human effort. Something else had clearly been holding this together the entire time. It would be easy to stop the story right here. A ruined city, a broken people, a leader who wept and prayed and planned and built, and now a finished wall, standing as proof that faithfulness eventually pays off. That would make a satisfying ending, the kind that closes clean, the kind most retellings of this story are tempted to end on. But the stones going back into place were never actually the deepest problem this story set out to solve, and the book itself refuses to let the story rest there. The wall could keep an enemy army outside the gates. It could not, by itself, do anything about what was happening inside the hearts of the people who now stood safely behind it. A city can be physically secure and still be spiritually hollow. A family can look repaired on the surface and still be carrying wounds nobody has actually dealt with. A life can appear rebuilt from the outside, while the person living it still feels like a stranger to who they were always meant to become. The stones were back in place. The gates could finally close the way gates are supposed to close. But the deeper question hanging over Jerusalem that evening had very little to do with whether the city could now defend itself. It had everything to do with whether the people standing inside those walls could actually be restored, not just protected. That question is exactly where the story turns next. They gathered together as one in the square in front of the water gate. This was not a small assembly. Men and women, and all who were able to understand, stood together in that open space, waiting for something that had not happened in a very long time. A man named Ezra brought out the book of the law of Moses and stood on a wooden platform built specifically for the occasion, high enough that everyone could see him. He opened the book, and as soon as he did, the entire crowd stood up, not a few of them out of politeness, all of them together, rising to their feet the moment the scroll opened, as though something in them recognized the weight of what was about to happen, before a single word was even read aloud. He read from it, from daybreak until noon, facing the men and women who could understand. And all the people listened attentively. Several hours of continuous reading, and nobody left. The Levites moved through the crowd as Ezra read, making it clear, giving the meaning so the people understood what was being read. It was not enough for the words to simply be spoken. Someone needed to walk among the people and make sure the meaning actually landed, because words that go unexplained tend to wash over a crowd without changing anything underneath the surface. And then something happened that had not happened back in the palace. At the very beginning of this story, though on the surface it looks almost identical, the people wept as they listened to the words of the law. The story began with weeping too. Remember Nehemiah, sitting alone in a hallway, hearing about broken walls and burned gates, mourning for days before he did anything else. That earlier weeping was the sound of grief meeting devastation for the first time. The sound of a man finally letting himself feel the full weight of something he had spent years quietly avoiding. This weeping is different. Even though it looks the same from the outside, this is not despair over ruins. This is recognition. This is an entire community hearing, out loud, together, the story of who they were always meant to be, and feeling the distance between that calling and the compromises they had actually been living in. Nehemiah, watching this unfold, does something worth paying attention to. He does not let the moment stay in mourning. This day is holy to the Lord your God. He tells them, do not mourn or weep. Go and enjoy choice food and sweet drinks, and send some to those who have nothing prepared. Nor should you grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. The joy of the Lord is your strength. That line lands with particular force here, because for months this community had been running on a very different kind of strength. The strength of urgency, the strength of fear working alongside determination. A sword in one hand, while a tool stayed in the other. The strength of sheer, stubborn endurance. Refusing to stop, even when their own bodies said they had nothing left to give. Now, with the wall standing, and the law finally read aloud, Nehemiah points them toward a different kind of strength altogether. One that does not come from grinding through exhaustion, but from remembering, clearly and joyfully, exactly whose people they actually were. The people went away to eat and drink, to send portions of food, and to celebrate with great joy, because they now understood the words that had been made known to them. What follows is easy to walk past quickly, but it carries enormous weight. The people discovered, written in the law, that they were supposed to observe the Festival of Tabernacles, living for 7 days in temporary shelters as a remembrance of how their ancestors once lived when they had nothing permanent at all, wandering through the wilderness with no walls, no gates, no city to call their own. And the Israelites had not celebrated it like this since the days of Joshua. Great joy. The text calls it centuries, an entire tradition, meant to remind a people of where they came from and what they had been rescued from, had quietly gone unpracticed in this way for so long that nobody currently alive had ever actually seen it done the way it was originally intended. That says something about how thoroughly this community's memory had eroded, long before a single stone of the wall ever fell. The walls did not collapse first. The remembering did. The practices that once tied a people to their own story had quietly stopped, one generation at a time, until nobody was even sure anymore what had been lost. The wall gave Jerusalem its shape back. Anyone standing outside the city could look at it now and see something whole again, something that finally matched what a city was supposed to look like. But it was this moment, standing in the square, weeping and then celebrating, hearing words that had gone unheard for far too long, that actually began giving the people back something the wall alone could never have restored. Not just a boundary to live inside, an identity to live out of. This is where a story like this usually likes to end. A city rebuilt, a people renewed, a leader vindicated. But Nehemiah's own account does not stop here, and it would be a disservice to what actually happened to pretend it did. There is one more return to Jerusalem still ahead, and it does not go the way anyone standing in that square that day would have expected. Time passed. The wall stood. Jerusalem, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, actually looked like a city again. Nehemiah eventually returned to Susa. Back to the king he still served. Back to the palace, where this entire story had first begun with a report that broke him. He had asked for leave to rebuild a wall, not permission to stay in Jerusalem forever. And after some time away, he went back to fulfill that original obligation. Then, after a while, he asked the king for permission to return to Jerusalem once more, and the king granted it. What he found waiting for him there was not the city he had left behind. He walked into the temple courts, into the very heart of the place meant to be most protected from compromise, and discovered that a room, one of the large storerooms that had once held offerings, grain, wine, oil, and the portions set aside for the Levites and singers who served there, had been cleared out and turned into private living quarters. And the man now living in that room, given the space by the high priest himself, was Tobiah, the same Tobiah who had mocked the builders, saying a fox could knock down their wall. The same Tobiah who had joined the coalition plotting armed attack against the city. The same Tobiah who had helped orchestrate letters and false invitations designed to lure Nehemiah away from his post. That man was now living inside the temple itself, given a room by a priest who should have known better. Sometime during the exact stretch of years Nehemiah had been away, I was greatly displeased. Nehemiah writes, and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. He did not stop there. He gave orders to purify the rooms, and had the articles of the house of God restored to them, along with the grain offerings and incense. That was only the beginning of what he found unraveling. The portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, so they and the singers responsible for temple service had gone back to their own fields just to survive, just abandoning the work entirely because nobody was providing for them anymore. People were treading wine presses on the Sabbath, hauling in grain, loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and every kind of load, selling goods openly in Jerusalem on the very day set apart to be holy. Merchants and traders from outside the city were spending the night just beyond the walls, waiting for the Sabbath to end so they could sell their goods the moment it was technically over. Treating the boundary of the holy day the way a person treats a line, they intend to step across the instant nobody official is watching and into marriage with surrounding peoples. The very compromise that had helped unravel the nation generations earlier was quietly happening again. Enough that some of the children being raised in Jerusalem could no longer even speak the language of their own people. None of this had happened while Nehemiah was standing at the wall, with a sword in one hand and a trumpeter close by his side. All of it had happened during the stretch of time he was somewhere else. The compromises did not creep in during the hard years, when everyone was exhausted and afraid, and the enemy was gathering just outside the gate. They crept in during the easy years. Once the danger had passed, once the wall was standing, once it finally felt safe enough to stop paying close attention, Nehemiah's response, once again, was not gentle. He confronted the nobles directly. "What is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day?" he demanded. "Didn't your ancestors do the same things, so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath." He ordered the city gates shut before the Sabbath began each week, and kept shut until it ended. and he stationed some of his own men at the gates to make sure no load could be brought in on the holy day. When merchants tried camping outside the wall anyway, waiting for the Sabbath to end, he warned them plainly that if they did it again, he would lay hands on them himself. They stopped coming on the Sabbath after that. He confronted the men who had intermarried outside the covenant as well. And his anger here was physical, not just verbal. He rebuked them, called curses down on them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair, making them take an oath before God that it would not happen again. It is a jarring image to end a story on, not a peaceful final scene of a city fully restored and permanently at rest. A leader, years after the wall was finished, still standing in the gap, still shouting down compromises that had quietly slipped back in, while his attention had been elsewhere for even a short time. The book closes with Nehemiah praying almost the exact same kind of prayer he had prayed at the very beginning, except now it carries a different weight entirely. Remember me with favor, my God, he writes more than once in these final pages. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done. Not a triumphant closing statement, a request to be remembered, offered by a man who had clearly come to understand something the finished wall alone could never have taught him. 52 days had been enough to rebuild the stones. It was not nearly enough to guarantee that what had been rebuilt would stay that way. Almost anything broken can eventually be rebuilt, given enough grief allowed to run its full course. Enough honest prayer, enough people willing to take the section of wall closest to their own front door, enough endurance to keep working with a tool in one hand through the exhausting middle of it. That much this story makes clear. But rebuilt is never the same thing as finished. A marriage repaired after real damage still needs to be tended. Year after year, long after the crisis that nearly ended, it has faded into the past. A habit broken still needs to be watched, quietly, for far longer than anyone wants to keep watching it. A faith recovered after years of drifting still needs someone willing to notice when the old compromises start finding their way back in, through a door nobody thought to check. Truth 6. And it is the one this whole story has been walking toward from the very first tear Nehemiah shed in that palace hallway. Broken things can be rebuilt, sometimes faster than anyone watching would have believed possible. But whatever gets rebuilt has to be guarded for the rest of a life, not only from enemies standing outside the wall, but from the quiet compromises that always seem to find their way back in the moment. Nobody is standing watch at the gate anymore. You do not have to look far to find your own version of this story. A relationship you thought was finally healed, a discipline you thought you had finally mastered, a faith you thought had finally settled into something solid. Somewhere in your life, something you once rebuilt with real tears and real effort is probably standing right now, and the only honest question left is whether anyone is still watching the gate.